China is relaxing COVID restrictions in some major cities after days of public protests calling for a lift down of lockdown measures. In parts of the southern city of Guangzhou, where there have been protests, some rules have been lifted. People identified as close contacts of positive cases are being allowed to quarantine in their own homes rather than in centralised facilities. Similar changes have been seen in parts of Beijing and other cities. Well, I'm joined from London by Cindy Yu, who's assistant editor at The Spectator and host of the podcast Chinese Whispers. Cindy, thank you very much for joining us. How are you viewing the slight easing of these restrictions?
Well, I'm waiting to see if they really keep it up and if they go further than just Guangzhou and Beijing as in examples that you've mentioned. Because just over a month ago, we really heard very similar things about these optimization measures that the central government was instructing others to put in. And that actually led to a fair amount of flip-flopping from local officials who had no idea what they were meant to do. You know, they had this instruction from above to open up a bit more, and yet they knew that their heads would be on the line if infections rose. So you had examples like the city of Shijiazhuang, which is a city of 11 million people, opening up, locking down again after 9 days. So, you know, I'm waiting and seeing. I'm rather cautiously optimistic at the moment.
Yeah, to what extent do you think it is the protests and the amount of attention they received since last weekend that have led to this slight lifting?
I think it does seem like the protests definitely contributed. I mean, as I mentioned, before the protests, the government was already talking about optimization. But because of the confusion on the ground and because local officials knew that their necks would be on the line if infections rose, they were scared to really do that much about it. And then you had disasters like the Xinjiang fire, which triggered to the protest last weekend. And so I think after the protests, and given that the protests haven't happened in the last few days, the central government is trying to give these carrots to people whilst punishing those who they know were involved in terms of the ringleaders, and using this kind of method to try to quell public anger. But as I say, I really need to see whether or not this is lip service and if this is actually going to lead to real easing, because some of the stuff we're talking about is really not incredibly liberal at all. Allowing close contact to quarantine at home should have been allowed, you know, months ago. So I think we'll have to wait and see what actual things they do, especially on vaccination as well.
Yeah, and given how extraordinarily strict and against the general tide that these restrictions have been, how does President Xi ultimately row back from this policy without losing face, without it looking like a climb down and having got it wrong?
So one way that he can do it is through new expert knowledge, which is something that we're seeing on Chinese social media at the moment. Now, experts are coming out to say that there are no after effects or there are no long-term conditions that come from COVID. So there's something called long COVID, but previously state media had said that you might have, you know, long-term, lifelong complications from getting COVID, which obviously scared a lot of people, especially about children getting infected. Now you've got experts coming out and saying there's no evidence for this kind of stuff. Oh, they're starting to learn a bit more about Omicron. You know, is that kind of twisting, you know, that's like that kind of shifting the ground on public knowledge, trying to kind of limit the amount of public fear about the virus that they themselves built up over the last few years. That's one way to do it. Another way is to blame local officials by saying, you know, they were always overzealous. We never wanted them to go this far. But of course, local officials get their signals from somewhere. So there are all sorts of ways, rhetorical and practical, that President Xi can step down. But ultimately, the linchpin, the thing that matters most, is whether or not he is going to vaccinate the elderly at a greater pace and using possibly more effective vaccines than he has done so far.
Right, and I wonder where you see the protests going. We had the death of Jiang Zemin 24 hours ago, that announcement. Do you see that as a potential trigger point? And how do you see the response from the authorities deterring people from going out on the streets?
There is the possibility that Jiang Zemin's death triggers more protests, especially when the memorial for him is held in the coming days. China has a history of this kind of stuff happening when people die. And people don't know that Tiananmen Square, the protest in 1989, was actually triggered by students mourning the death of Hu Yaoban, who was a communist official who was seen to be a bit more liberal in the structure. And then before then, the death of Zhou Enlai, 10 years before, also triggered protests. On the other hand, Jiang Zemin was never been seen as much of a liberal reformer. Of course, on economics, he was the president who took China into the WTO. He was a president who really took after Deng Xiaoping and opening China up economically. But politically, he was also the person who the communist officials chose after 1989, the violent crackdown. So I'm not sure he inspires the same kind of ideological loyalty that someone like Hu Yaobang or Zhou Enlai really did. And I think for now, the protests have been quelled. The officials have been very, very effective in putting heavy police presence in all of the hotspots, ensuring that people can't really go there. Troublemaking students have been sent home early on winter break. And I think the question about whether or not zero COVID is really going to change is critical, because if it doesn't, something else happening like the Xinjiang fire could just very easily trigger more protests. So I think the authorities have to kind of give real ground here in order to satisfy the level of public frustration that's just background at the moment.
Cindy Yu, very interesting to talk to you. Thank you very much, Assistant Editor at The Spectator.